Right, so I'm going to look at Iran. My background is energy, so I'm not going to get into the politics. I'll leave that for you to infer. But before I really get into these slides, I just want to talk for a moment about what are the differences really between the two countries that we're looking at here. Because there's some massive differences from an energy perspective. So Saudi Arabia won the lottery on crude oil, okay? Massive resources of crude oil, largest in the world. Maybe the second largest if you count Venezuela. I wouldn't count Venezuela because most of that will never see the light of day, for 10 reasons. Saudi Arabia did not win the lottery on natural gas. Iran did, okay? And if you want to see the extent to which they won the lottery, Iran is currently claimed as the largest natural gas reserves in the world. That's because Russia got devalued a few years ago. There were some restatements. I think some people still think Russia has bigger reserves, but at the end of the day, it almost doesn't matter because there's still another crucial difference between Iran and Russia, and that's that Russia is a huge producer of natural gas. Even with their enormous reserves, their reserve life, so typically what you look at is you simply take the proved reserves and you divide that by the production rate, right? And it tells you how many years of gas you have forward. At current rates of production, Russia can produce for 56 years based on these proved reserves. It doesn't really work that way, but that's sort of the shorthand that people use. Iran produces a lot less. So Iran can produce at current rates based on its proved reserves for 166 years. That's the current calculation. To put that in perspective, the US, which is the world's largest producer of natural gas, based on our proved reserves, we can produce for 11.6 years. Okay? Now, we will end up with a lot more gas than that because a lot of gas hasn't migrated into the category of proved reserves. But when I start looking at Iran, the first question that I ask is, where does nuclear really fit? Why would you pursue nuclear? So if you go back here, this is different from the other slides. This isn't capacity. This is actual energy. So this is terawatt hours, or 1,000 gigawatt hours, or million megawatt hours, or billion kilowatt hours, however you want to look at that. The light blue is natural gas. That's where they're getting their energy. Okay? Nuclear is this little, it's this little tiny yellow sliver. You can barely see it, right? And hydro, where does hydro show up? It's the red at the top. Hydro looks bigger when you look at capacity, but when you look at capacity, you're not counting the dry months. Right? So there's a lot of months in the year where hydro doesn't work very well. So when I look at this, I say, well, gosh, they're producing all this electricity from gas. Is that sustainable? Can you continue to do that? Don't you need something like nuclear power to back that up? And the answer is, I think in the case of Iran, you don't. Okay? And the reason is these reserves. Okay? So from an energy perspective, you say, okay, well, how good are these reserves really? Right? How does that compare to other people? So in order to understand this, you really need to understand the difference between reserves and resources. Because those two terms are used interchangeably in this town, but I guarantee you, if you go to Houston or if you go to another energy town, they mean completely different things. People do not talk about resources and make the same comparisons that you make with reserves for the following reason. So this is how the Securities and Exchange Commission looks at reserves and resources. And this is a chart from the Society of Petroleum Engineers. They're sort of the custodians of this with the Securities and Exchange Commission. About 10 years ago, they looked at how all the major producers in the world account for their reserves. And they applied this lens to it. And they basically concluded that pretty much everybody looks at it the same way. They didn't look at Iran specifically. I haven't dug into Iran specifically, but let's say that Iran looks at reserves the same way that the Russians, and the Chinese, and the Saudis, and everybody else pretty much does. So in that case, you have these different categories of resources, okay? And you look at things like the technical risk of actually getting the material out of the ground. How difficult is the reservoir to develop? And then you have commercial risks. right? So the price is X today. Will the price be 2X or 1/2 X tomorrow? How does that affect your view of reserves? And what you find is that actual proved reserves is this little corner up here, okay? In order to get into that corner, what you have to qualify as is, this is per the Society of Petroleum Engineers, proved reserves have a reasonable certainty of being recovered, which means a high degree of confidence that the volumes will be recovered. Reserves must have all commercial aspects addressed. There's technical issues which separate proved from unproved reserves, okay? Now within this little bubble of proved reserves, there's 3 categories. Proved developed, proved non-producing, so something that you discovered, you started producing it, and maybe you stopped producing it for some reason, and then proved undeveloped. So in the case of Iran, interestingly enough, 83% of their reserves, the proved reserves, are what's called proved undeveloped. If you go to Houston, they'll talk about PUDs. That's what a PUD is, proved undeveloped. So how good is all of this, okay? Do they really have what they claim? I can't answer that definitively, but one of the interesting factors in this is, and I wish I had the map here, but the largest gas field in the world is shared between Iran and Qatar. Thank you. It's called, the Qataris call it the North Field, and in Iran it's South Pars. Right? Largest gas field in the world by a pretty wide margin. 47% of Iran's proved reserves are in South Pars. So you say, okay, so here's a field that they share with another country that's developing this rapidly, massive LNG developments and things like that. Pretty good gauge that, I was pushing buttons.
Yeah, we're fine.
So I think it's a reasonable gauge that at least half of what they're claiming is probably legit. And that because you're up here in this little bubble, if they've got as much gas proved as they claim, then the amount of technically recoverable reserves that back that up are probably vast. So the US has proved reserves of 307 trillion cubic feet. We have technically recoverable reserves of 2.4 quadrillion cubic feet, right? So if Iran is claiming a little over 1 quadrillion cubic feet, I have no idea how much technically recoverable reserves they've got backing that up, but it's probably a heck of it. So, and there's not the same reason. I don't know if you're as old as me, you will remember that in the 90s, there was this whole debate about how real were OPEC crude oil reserves, because they got into this game of competitive revaluations of reserves because, funnily enough, the OPEC quotas were based on reserves. So if you had bigger reserves, you could produce more oil under your quota, and that actually mattered at the time. So they were gaming the system. Who knows how much oil they really had? But that never happened with gas. There was no reason for them to fudge the gas numbers the way I think the crude numbers got fudged in the 1930s. So I have a little more confidence in the gas numbers. So there's enough gas here to do pretty much anything that you want with. They've been increasing their gas production at 6% a year, and they've been doing that with local technology and local human factors, right? Access to international finance, to international technology, and they haven't, it's all conventional. They haven't even touched the potential shale resources. So massive reserves down the road. You know, the others talked about the solar resources in the area. Iran's not as good as Saudi Arabia, there's no question about that. But southern Iran is about as good as the southwest of the US, and at current costs of these technologies, that's plenty good. So between solar and gas, you can probably do just about anything that you want, energy-wise, in Iran. So the question that I come down to, and I've got a chart here on levelized costs as well, but you know, to me, Iran is not resource constrained. That's the key. Iran has the resources, natural gas and solar and a bit of wind, to do anything that it wants. Okay? They're not resource constrained. What they are is capital constrained, particularly because of the effect of sanctions and because of the perception that sanctions could come back. They're capital constrained. So, okay, so here you are And you've got all of these resources, and all that's holding you back from developing them is capital. And by the way, nuclear is the highest cost thing, at least on their page. And what is the biggest impediment to getting the capital to develop these other resources? It's actually their nuclear energy. So not only is nuclear energy the most expensive choice that they can make as an energy technology, it's the thing that's actually standing in the way of getting the international finance that they would need to develop their actual resources to the extent that would be necessary to meet all of their future energy needs as far as the eye can see. So when I look at this as an energy guy, the only word that I can use is enigma. Right? This is an enigma. Why would a country that has all of these resources focus so much painful effort on something that stands in the way of getting those resources to them? I leave you to answer the question.